The land took everything first, then the fever took what was left. She had already lost everything. The ranch her family had worked for, the man she loved, and the hope that life could ever be kind again. But then, a gruff widower with 4 children appeared on the horizon, offering her a new name, a new home, and maybe a second chance at love. Could she trust him? Or was tragedy waiting to strike once more? Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more forgotten Western love stories. Now, here's how it all unfolded. The creek stopped running in June. Sarah Brennan stood at the edge of the dry bed where water used to sing over stones, and she thought, is this what the end looks like? Not fire, not flood, just absence, just silence, just the white bones of earth showing through. She was 24 years old and her hands were older. The ranch had belonged to her father, then to her and Thomas, then to the Drought, and now to the bank. She stood there at the place where she'd filled buckets every morning for 3 years, and the dust devils spun across the cracked ground like ghosts dancing at a funeral they'd already forgotten. Thomas had said they'd make it through. Thomas had said the rains would come and the cattle would survive and they'd replant come spring. And his voice had been so sure, so steady, even when his hands started shaking. And when the fever climbed behind his eyes like something wild trying to get out, Sarah had believed him. Because what else do you believe when the man you married at 17 tells you the sky will open, tells you God hasn't forgotten, tells you to hold on? The fever took him in August. Took him fast, the way prairie fire takes dry grass, and there wasn't time for goodbyes or any last words. Just his hand in hers getting hotter and hotter until she thought she'd burn too, and then his hand went cold. The silence in the room was louder than any scream she'd ever heard. She didn't cry. Not then. Crying was for people who still had something left to lose, and Sarah Brennan née Porter had already given it all to the cracked earth and the empty sky and the grave she dug herself because there wasn't money for the undertaker, or anything except the shovel she borrowed from the neighbors who looked at her with eyes that said, poor thing. She sold the cattle first, and she got $20 for the lot of them. $20 that went to the bank, to the doctor who'd come too late, and to the store for flour and beans and the kind of cheap coffee that tastes like you're drinking dirt. The house went next. The house her father had built with timber hauled from 50 miles away. The house where she'd been born, where she'd married Thomas, where she'd imagined raising children, and now a man from Denver with soft hands and a watch chain bought it for a fraction of what it was worth and told her she was lucky, told her some folks got nothing, told her she should be grateful. She didn't feel grateful. She felt hollow. She packed what she could carry into a canvas bag, her mother's Bible, her father's pocket watch, the blue dress she'd married in, and a red handkerchief Thomas had given her the first Christmas they'd been wed. The neighbors took her in for a week, the Hoffmans, who had 4 children of their own and barely enough to feed them. Mrs. Hoffman gave Sarah the room where they stored preserves. Sarah slept on a corn husk mattress between jars of tomatoes and pickles and tried not to hear the whispered conversations through the walls. The ones about what to do with her, where she could go, whether she had people back east. And on the 7th night, she heard Mr. Hoffman say, "We can't keep her forever." Heard Mrs. Hoffman say, I know, but what's she going to do?" And Sarah lay there in the dark between the preserve jars and understood that she had become a problem, had become a burden, had become the kind of thing people solve by looking away. She left before dawn, didn't say goodbye, didn't leave a note, just took her canvas bag and walked out into the September cold with no destination, no plan, just the knowledge that staying meant watching pity turn to resentment, meant becoming smaller and smaller in their eyes until she disappeared entirely. The road stretched empty in both directions. East toward towns she'd never seen, toward cities that felt like stories someone had made up, and west toward mountains that stood blue and distant like a promise no one intended to keep. And she stood there in the middle of the road with dust on her boots and the sun coming up red and angry, and thought, maybe this is how it ends. Maybe this is where the story stops. But then she heard the wagon. The wagon came from the west, came slow, with the sound of creaking wood and harness leather, and Sarah stepped to the side of the road and waited and watched it approach. And even from a distance she could see it was overloaded, could see the way the horses strained, could see children's heads poking over the sides like prairie dogs checking for hawks. The man driving didn't look at her at first. He was big, the kind of big that comes from work, not from eating well. And his beard was dark, shot through with gray, his hat was pulled low, and his shoulders were set like a man carrying more than just the weight of the wagon. When he finally did look at her, his eyes were the color of winter sky, flat and careful and holding nothing back but holding nothing forward either. He didn't stop, but he slowed enough that she could see the children properly. 4 of them, ranging from maybe 10 down to maybe 3, they all had the same dark hair, the same wary eyes, the same way of watching her like she was a coyote that might run, bite, or might do anything at all. "You lost?" His voice was rough, unused, like a tool left in the rain. No. She didn't know why she said it that way, didn't know why she didn't say yes, didn't say please, didn't say I have nowhere to go, but something in his face made her stand straighter, made her chin come up, made her meet those winter eyes without flinching. He studied her for a long moment, studied her the way you study fence line, looking for breaks, looking for weak spots, and she could see him taking inventory of her worn boots, her canvas bag, her hands that showed every chore she'd ever done. "You running from something or towards something?" "Neither." She shifted the bag on her shoulder. "Just running out." The smallest child made a sound, and one of the older ones, a girl with braids, hushed her, and the man's jaw worked like he was chewing on words, trying to decide if they were worth spitting out. "I'm headed to Colorado Territory," he said finally. "Got a claim near a place called Mercy Creek, needs a lot of work, needs more hands than I've got. Could use someone who knows how to work." It wasn't a job offer, wasn't charity, wasn't anything she could name, but something in the way he said it, in the way he didn't look away, didn't soften his voice, didn't treat her like glass about to break, made her throat tight. "I can work," she said. "I expect so." He glanced at the children, then back to her. "These are my children. Lost their mother last spring to the same fever that's been taking everyone. They need tending, need teaching, need someone who won't break when things get hard." His eyes held hers. "Things are going to get hard. Things are already hard." Something almost like approval crossed his face. "Name's Jacob Thornton," he said, and there was no warmth in it, no welcome, just fact, just statement, just the way you'd say rain or stone or winter. "These are Clara, Matthew, Hannah, and that's Ruth. She's 3. Sarah looked at the children, looked at their dirty faces, their 2 big eyes, their hands gripping the wagon sides, and she saw herself at 10, at 7, at 5, saw the way loss makes you old before your time, makes you careful, makes you wait for the next bad thing, because the next bad thing always comes. "Sarah Brennan," she said, "you got people waiting for you somewhere?" "No." "You got somewhere you're supposed to be?" "No." He nodded once. Like that settled something. And just like that, she climbed up into the wagon bed and sat among the bundles and crates and tools and 4 children who watched her like she was a riddle they hadn't learned to read yet. Jacob Thornton clicked his tongue and the horses pulled, the wagon creaked forward, and Sarah Brennan, who had lost everything, whose name was attached to nothing, whose future had dried up like the creek, looked back once at the road behind them and then didn't look back again. They rode in silence for miles. The children whispered among themselves, and Clara, the oldest at 10, watched Sarah with eyes that held more suspicion than any child should carry. And Matthew, who was maybe 8, sat with his arms crossed like a man guarding something precious. And Hannah, who was 5, played with a cornhusk doll. And Ruth, the baby, slept against a bundle of blankets with her thumb in her mouth. "They don't like strangers," Jacob said without turning around. "That's smart," Sarah said. "Their mother died in my arms." He said it flat, said it like a thing that happened and not a thing that broke him. But Sarah heard the edge underneath, heard the place where his voice almost cracked, almost failed. "Told me to find them a mother, told me not to let them grow up hard." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know how to do that." Sarah watched the children, watched the way Clara held Matthew's hand, watched the way Hannah leaned against her sister, watched the way they'd made a circle that didn't include anyone else. "Maybe they don't need a mother," she said. "Maybe they just need someone who stays." Jacob was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "Can you stay?" he asked finally. Sarah thought about the empty ranch, thought about Thomas cold in the ground, thought about sleeping in the preserve room, thought about the road stretching empty in both directions. "I don't have anywhere else to be," she said. Mercy Creek wasn't much of a town. A general store, a saloon, a church that looked like a strong wind would knock it over, and maybe 30 families scattered across the valley, most of them holding on by their fingernails. Holding on because leaving meant admitting defeat, and the West didn't forgive people who admitted defeat. Jacob's claim was 5 miles out, 5 miles of rocky soil and scrub grass and a creek that still ran thin and silver between cottonwood trees. And when Sarah saw the cabin, her heart dropped, because she'd seen poverty before, but this was poverty with ambition. This was a man trying to build something from nothing with 4 children and no help and no time. The cabin had 3 rooms, one for Jacob, one for the children, and one that was supposed to be a kitchen but was really just a fireplace and a table and some shelves that held almost nothing. And Sarah stood in the doorway with her canvas bag and looked at what she'd agreed to and thought, maybe I should have stayed on the road, maybe I should have kept walking. "It's not much," Jacob said, and there was no apology in his voice, just fact. "No," Sarah agreed, "it's not." The children filed in, silent and watchful, and Clara immediately went to the fireplace and started building up the fire with the ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times, and Matthew hauled in water from the creek. Hannah set out tin plates, and Ruth clung to Clara's skirt and didn't look at Sarah at all. "They've been doing these for themselves," Jacob said. "Since Martha died. I worked the claim, worked the fields, and they managed the house." He pulled off his hat, and his hair was matted with sweat. "It's not right, them carrying so much, but there's only so many hours in a day, only so many hands." Sarah set down her bag. "Show me where things are," she said, and Clara, who had been listening while pretending not to listen, turned and looked at her with eyes that were 50 years old in a 10-year-old face. "We don't need help," Clara said, and her voice was sharp, was protective. Was the voice of a girl who'd become a mother when no one asked her if she wanted to. "We've been managing just fine." "Clara," Jacob's voice held warning, but Sarah held up her hand. "You're right," she said, and she looked at Clara, really looked at her. Saw the exhaustion, the weight, the way this child was holding herself together with spite and stubbornness and sheer will. "You have been managing. You've been doing a job that's too big for you, and you've been doing it without complaint. And that takes more strength than most grown women have." Clara's jaw clenched, but something flickered in her eyes. The room was quiet. Ruth peeked out from behind Clara's skirt, and Matthew had stopped pretending not to listen. Hannah hugged her cornhusk doll tighter, and Jacob stood with his hat in his hands, looking at Sarah like she'd just done something he hadn't known was possible. "I'm not here to replace your mother," Sarah said. "No one can do that. But I'm here to help carry what you've been carrying alone, and if you want to teach me where things go and how things are done, I'll listen, because you know this house better than I ever will." Clara stared at her for a long moment. Then slowly, carefully, like she was testing ice in early spring, she nodded. "Flour's in the tin on the top shelf," Clara said. "Beans are in the crock. We're low on salt and we're out of sugar, and the bread needs making every other day because it goes stale fast in the heat." "All right," Sarah said. And just like that, she'd passed some tests she hadn't known she was taking. The days found their rhythm. Sarah woke before dawn and started the fire and made coffee from grounds they'd used 3 times already. And by the time Jacob came in from checking the animals, the cabin smelled like bread rising, and Clara would be braiding Hannah's hair, and Matthew would be hauling wood, and Ruth would be following Sarah around like a shadow, quiet and watching and waiting. Sarah cooked and the children ate without complaint. Matthew started talking to her. Started telling her about the rabbit he was tracking, about the hawk's nest up in the cottonwoods, about how his pa had promised to teach him to read once the harvest was in. And Sarah listened. One afternoon, she pulled out her mother's Bible and said, "I could teach you now if you want." And his face lit up like she'd offered him the moon. Ruth stopped hiding, stopped watching from behind Clara's skirt, and started climbing into Sarah's lap while she sewed, started falling asleep against her shoulder, started calling her Miss Sarah in a voice so small and sweet it hurt to hear. And Clara was the hardest nut to crack, was the one who watched longest, trusted slowest, who remembered her mother best and clearest and held that memory like a shield. But one night Sarah found her crying in the garden, crying over the tomato plants that were finally bearing fruit. And Sarah didn't ask, didn't push, just sat down beside her in the dirt and waited. "She planted these," Clara said finally. "Mama. She said they'd be ready by fall, said we'd make sauce, said we'd have tomatoes all winter." Her voice broke. "She didn't even get to see them bloom." Sarah looked at the tomatoes, red and heavy on the vine. "She knew they would, though," Sarah said. "She knew because she planted them, because she put them in the ground and trusted the earth to do its work. And that's faith. That's the hardest kind of faith there is." Clara wiped her face with her sleeve. "I don't want to forget her," she whispered. "You won't," Sarah said. "Every time you make bread the way she taught you, every time you braid Hannah's hair, every time you look after Matthew and Ruth, you're remembering her. You're keeping her alive in the things you do, in the person you're becoming." She paused. "And I'm not here to make you forget. I'm here so you can remember without it being the only thing you have to do." Clara looked at her then. Really looked at her. "Do you think she'd mind?" Clara asked. "That you're here?" Sarah thought about Thomas, thought about the life she'd lost, thought about how love doesn't diminish by being shared but grows by being given away. "I think she'd be grateful," Sarah said. "I think she'd be glad you have someone to help carry it." And Clara leaned against her shoulder and cried. Jacob proposed on a Tuesday. Proposed wasn't quite the right word because there was no knee, no ring, no pretty speech. Just the two of them standing by the creek after supper while the children played in the last light, and he said, "I think we should marry." Sarah looked at him. "Why?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, watching the water slide over rocks. "Because the children need a mother in name, not just in fact," he said. "Because people talk, and I won't have them talking about you, won't have them saying you're something you're not." He glanced at her. "Do you love me?" she asked, not because she needed him to say yes, but because she needed to know what she was agreeing to. "I don't know," he said, and the honesty of it cut but didn't wound. "I loved Martha, loved her fierce, loved her until it felt like I'd die when she did. And I did die, some part of me died with her, and I don't know if what's left is enough to love anyone the way a husband should love a wife." He turned to face her fully. "But I respect you, trust you, need you, and maybe that's enough. Maybe that's more than most people get." Sarah thought about the ranch, thought about Thomas burning up with fever, thought about how love hadn't saved her, hadn't saved anything. "All right," she said. They married the following Sunday. Married in the church that looked like it might blow over with the preacher who stuttered, and the whole town watching with eyes that held curiosity, held judgment, held the kind of interest people have in watching whether something will work or fall apart. And Sarah wore the blue dress she'd married Thomas in. She didn't cry, not when she said "I do." Not when Jacob slipped a thin gold band on her finger, not when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, but when they walked out of the church and Clara took her hand, took it without being asked, took it like it was the most natural thing in the world. At home, after the simple meal, after the children went to bed, Jacob stood in the doorway of what was now their room and said, "I don't expect anything. You can take the bed, I'll take the floor." And Sarah looked at this man who'd given her a name, who'd made her legitimate, who'd offered respect when others offered pity. "We're married," she said. "That means sharing." So they shared the bed, shared it like two people seeking warmth, not passion, seeking comfort, not fire. And he held her careful. held her like she might break, and she let herself be held, let herself rest, let herself believe that maybe this was enough, maybe this could become something. The name changed everything and nothing. She was Sarah Thornton now, not Sarah Brennan, and people in town nodded to her now, called her Mrs. Thornton, asked her advice on preserving and baking and child-rearing, and she belonged in a way she hadn't before. Belonged to a family, belonged to a place, belonged to a story that was still being written. But more than that, she had children who called her Ma, not right away, not all at once, but slow, over weeks, over months. And the first time Ruth said Mama when Sarah picked her up after she'd fallen, Sarah's eyes burned and she held that child close, held her like a promise kept, like a prayer answered. Hannah said it next, said it casual while Sarah was braiding her hair, said, "Mama, can you make the braid tighter?" And Sarah's hands trembled, but she finished the braid, finished it perfect, and kissed the top of Hannah's head. Matthew said it quiet, said it one night when she was teaching him to read, said, "Mama, how do you say this word?" And Sarah looked up from the Bible and saw him watching her, waiting for her to correct him, waiting for her to say she wasn't really his mother, but she didn't say that, didn't say anything but the answer to his question. Clara took the longest, took months of watching, of testing, of making sure Sarah would stay, would keep staying, would be there when the hard things came. And it wasn't until spring when Sarah was sick with the same fever that had taken Martha. Sick enough that Jacob sent for the doctor, sick enough that the children stood outside the bedroom door with white faces, that Clara finally broke. Sarah woke to find Clara sitting beside the bed, holding her hand, holding it tight. "Don't die," Clara whispered. "Please, Mama, please don't die." And Sarah squeezed her hand, squeezed it with what little strength she had. "I'm not going anywhere," Sarah said, "I promise." She kept that promise, kept it through the fever, through the recovery, through the long months of rebuilding her strength, and Clara never left her side, never stopped watching over her, never stopped calling her Mama. And Sarah understood that this was trust, this was love, this was a daughter claiming a mother, not by blood, but by choice. Years passed. Sarah taught the children letters and numbers, taught them from the Bible, from the almanac, from seed packets and old newspapers. In Sarah's 5th year at Mercy Creek, in her 30th year of life, she felt the familiar flutter she'd stopped hoping for. And when the doctor confirmed it, when he said, "Yes, Mrs. Thornton, you're expecting," she sat down hard on the examination table and laughed and cried and couldn't tell the difference. Jacob took the news quiet, took it with the same careful expression he'd worn when he'd first offered her a place in his wagon. But when they were alone, when the children were asleep, he put his hand on her stomach, put it there gentle like he was touching something holy. "I thought I was done," he said. "Thought Martha was my last chance at this." "We get more than one chance," Sarah said. "If we're lucky, if we're willing to try again." The baby came in March. Came fast, came hard, and Sarah labored through the night with Clara holding one hand and Jacob holding the other, and Hannah praying in the corner, and Matthew pacing outside, and Ruth sleeping through it all. And when the baby finally came, squalling and red and alive, Sarah held her daughter and thought, "This is what redemption looks like. This is what it means to get a second chance." They named her Martha, named her after Jacob's first wife, after the woman who'd planted tomatoes and raised children and loved fiercely and died too young. And when Clara heard the name, her eyes filled, and she touched the baby's head with one finger and whispered, "Thank you." The land prospered. Not easily, not quickly, but steady. Soon Jacob expanded the claim, brought in more cattle, planted more wheat, and the garden that Sarah had revived became a source of food, became a source of income, became the thing people rode miles to see, because Sarah Thornton could grow anything, could make the stubborn earth yield. Moments came when Sarah would catch him watching her, when she'd feel his hand find hers at the table, when he'd pull her close at night, not for warmth but for want. And she realized that love doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just grows quiet, like a plant you didn't know you'd planted until you see it blooming. "I love you," he said one night. Said it simple, said it plain, said it like he was admitting something he'd been trying not to admit. And Sarah turned in his arms and looked at his face, weather-ed by sun, work, and grief, and saw that he meant it. She saw that he'd fought it and lost and finally surrendered. "I know," she said. "I love you too." It wasn't the wild, desperate love of her youth, wasn't the kind that burns hot and fast, but it was steady, was deep, and was the kind that lasts because it was built on shared work, on kept promises, on choosing each other not just once but every day. The town grew around them. Grew from 30 families to 60 to 100, and the church got a new roof, and the school got a new building. And Mercy Creek stopped being a place people passed through and became a place people stayed, and through it all. Sarah kept her garden, kept her family, kept her promise to the kids to be there when the hard things came. The garden kept growing, and Sarah kept tending it, kept teaching others to tend their own, kept showing anyone who asked that you don't need to be born to something to belong to it. You just need to be willing to stay, willing to work, willing to choose it every single day until choosing it becomes as natural as breathing. That's how love works on the frontier. That's how families grow from dust and determination. That's how you survive. If this story touched your heart, let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe, because every forgotten story deserves to be remembered. I'll see you in the next one.